The government took aim at striking ambulance teams today, saying new laws were needed to protect lives because paramedics' industrial action last month put patients at risk.
Health officials were left guessing at the likely minimum coverage, making contingency planning almost impossible and putting everyone's constituents' lives at risk. The ambulance strike plan for tomorrow still do not have minimum safety levels in place. And this will result in patchy emergency care for the British people, and this cannot continue.
Grant Shapps said the Royal College of Nursing had provided minimum care when nurses went on strike last month. The ambulance workers had not.
Category 1 is for calls about people with life-threatening injuries and illnesses, such as cardiac arrest or serious allergic reaction.
Some in the ambulance service suspect the government would draw the line of minimum service so high their strike was effectively banned.
I'm organising help for you now.
They suspect the government would like them to cover all Category 1 life-threatening calls, which they do already, and all Category 2 calls.
Ambulance service, is the patient breathing?
Rather than just the most serious Category 2 call-outs.
That would mean that most of the crews would be out doing the jobs that they are doing day in, day out. If that's what the government insisted, I can't see how we would be able to picket or strike. Because to be able to meet that level of call and demand would mean that the entirety of the staff have to be working. That's a stealth ban on striking.
Many other countries, Australia, Canada, parts of America, South Africa and elsewhere, actually ban strikes in blue light services. We ban them ourselves for the police, but I'm not even proposing going that far. All I'm saying is, please, tell us if you're going to withdraw your labour. Let's agree a minimum safety level. I don't think there's anything unreasonable about that whatsoever.
Union leaders met to explore whether they could coordinate future strikes to maximise impact. All condemned the proposed law, which would affect emergency services, but also other sectors, including transport, education and border security.
What it will do is remove the individual's right to strike. And I think if you look at public sentiment, people are very clear. If it comes down to a straight fight between Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt, Steve Barclay and our nurses, our paramedics, our physiotherapists, I know where public sympathy lies, and it lies with those hard-working public servants. So I think the government should think again and step back from these proposals.
Some Labour MPs said the government was throwing red meat to unite its squabbling backbenchers. A reminder of the Tories' recent torrid history came when it emerged that the Transport Secretary, here pictured with the failed Virgin satellite rocket next to Boris Johnson in the summer, had retweeted the picture with Boris Johnson airbrushed out of the shot. Ambulance picket lines tomorrow will be joined by control room staff, but they'll be staggering their strike hours to make sure emergency calls can still be answered. Anyone seriously ill is still advised to call 999.
Well, strikes by ambulance workers were singled out today by Grant Shapps, as you heard in Gary's report there, as one of the driving factors behind the government's decision to bring forward this legislation. And tomorrow, around 25,000 of them across England and Wales will again walk out over pay. Our health and social care editor, Victoria McDonald, joins us now from Warwick Hospital. Victoria.
Yes, well, you can imagine that the unions were furious about the claims from Grant Shapps that there had been no national agreement for emergency cover. They had always said, they told us, that there would be agreements reached, and indeed there were agreements reached with individual trusts because of the complexities of the staffing levels and the different needs of each region. So they said, instead, the union said that this statement from Grant Shapps was actually downright provocative, coming as it did on the eve of the strikes. And also, they said, just as they'd had what they felt was a reasonably constructive meeting with the Health Secretary. Now, you can't over-exaggerate this, but they did see an almost small glimmer of hope because they had, for the first time in the meetings, been able to discuss pay. Now, there's been nothing today back from the government that could in any way avert the strikes. There's been no mention of any other meetings which could avert further strikes later this month. But they said that they had they had come away from that meeting feeling a bit better, and now today they didn't.
So, Victoria, what can we expect from tomorrow's strike?
Well, as you heard from Gary, there are both the GMB and Unison will be going out. Now, I'm outside Warwick Hospital, and they have told us that the West Midlands Ambulance Service have assured them that the most urgent patients will be picked up, will be delivered here. There will also be some patient transport services for urgent cases as well, people who need urgent cancer treatments and things like renal dialysis. At the last month's strike, there was a reduction in 32,000 calls, emergency calls in this area. So what they are hoping is that the public will respond to that and not dial 999 unless they absolutely have to.
OK, thanks very much, Victoria. Matt?
Now, earlier I spoke to Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was Business Secretary under Liz Truss, and Rebecca Long-Bailey, who was Shadow Business Secretary under Jeremy Corbyn. I started by asking Mr Rees-Mogg whether he would be happy to see a nurse sacked as a result of this legislation.
Well, I think the Business Secretary has made it clear that that's not the intention of this legislation.
But it might happen.
But if you have minimum services agreements, then people would have a contractual obligation to follow those. But it wouldn't mean that there wouldn't be an ability to provide a different level of service. That what it would ensure is a basic service is provided, but that there would be instances where people would be able to work differently, short of a full strike on an essential service. So the ability of people to make their point, to make it clear that they weren't happy with their terms and conditions, would remain. But do I think that people should obey and fulfil the contracts of their employment? Yes, of course I do. That's the reasonable part of employment law. It's the quid pro quo, or it's the pro quo for the quid.
But we need all the nurses we can get at the moment. You know, if this legislation is imposed, it could result in nurses getting sacked. Are you happy to see that, yes or no?
Well, I think you're conflating two completely different things. That the recruitment of nurses is an issue and the training of nurses is an issue, and there are negotiations going on about pay. I think the idea that thousands of nurses would be fired under this legislation is ridiculous. That's not what this legislation will do. That is not the purpose of it.
But we don't know that.
Yes, we do. We know that that is a fanciful supposition of a circumstance that would not arise, that the aim is to ensure a minimum service. You don't end up firing the police because they go on strike, because they recognise they've got to provide the service. You don't fire the army when they have to stand in for ambulance drivers if ambulance drivers go on strike, because they recognise that's part of their terms and conditions. People accept the terms and conditions they have if they're reasonable, and not striking in essential services is reasonable, proportionate, and to Ms Long-Bailey's point, legal as well. What Parliament passes into law is the law of the land.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, I know that Jacob Rees-Mogg and this government doesn't like to follow Europe's lead, but they have mentioned the fact that this is a law that's already in existence in Spain, in France, in Italy, for instance, for exactly the same reasons. What's your answer to that?
There are very different conditions that exist in other parts of Europe. They have a more comprehensive collective bargaining system where many employers already engage frequently with those governments. So to discuss a minimum service level agreement before a strike would be easy to facilitate in these countries. We don't have that here in the UK. We've got some of the worst trade union legislation in the world as a result of various Conservative governments that have tried to drive down trade union rights. Now, we've got to get to the heart of what this is about, because the government know that this piece of legislation will be beset with legal challenges and legal problems, and we have to see this stunt for what it is, really. They're trying to frighten key workers away from the negotiating table to stop using their right to strike and ask for better pay, terms and conditions and funding for their sector now. That's what they're trying to do, close this debate down. And unfortunately, I think the public can see this for what it is. The public are behind striking workers. They want to see negotiations, and they want to see our key workers being respected and paid fairly.
So are you now telling me that you, Jacob Rees-Mogg, arch-Brexiteer, are happy to follow the lead of European countries like Italy, France and Spain on this?
Well, I think that's a silly point, quite honestly.
That's a very, very serious point, actually.
It's not a serious point at all. It's a
Come on, a little bit of generosity from you on that.
It's a joke point. Just because the sun shines in Spain doesn't mean that I'm against the sun shining in England, and to think otherwise would be foolish.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, let me ask you about something that's connected to this. There are several unions that are edging towards a de facto general strike. What they were discussing today at the TUC was a one-day of action, which sounds to me like a general strike in everything but name. Are you personally in favour of that?
Well, a general strike is actually illegal. Individuals, trade unions deciding to take action on behalf of their members isn't, and that's what's certainly happening. Individual unions are balloting their members for individual rounds of trade union action. And we've got to remember why. We're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Many workers are ringing the alarm that they simply don't have enough money to live on. When we've got a society where nurses are having to rely on food banks, we know that there's a huge, huge problem. And the government does have the power to address many of these issues.
But do you want to see coordinated actions between the unions?
I think it's up to the individual trade union members themselves.
I mean, you're hedging your bets rather like the leadership of your party. And to be honest, there are a lot of union bosses and union members who are fundamentally confused about whether the Labour Party supports their actions or not.
The Labour Party is the party of the trade union movement. Trade unions created the Labour Party.
But you're not on the picket lines.
I was on a picket line. I've been on
but
various
not your leadership.
picket lines. Well, they've got their own positions on this. You know, if you listen to Keir, for example, he wants to be in a position where he's negotiating and he's trying to address these disputes, which is what the government should be doing, quite frankly. But I'm proud as a Labour MP to stand on picket lines with trade union members because I want to support them and I want to see a resolution to these negotiations and disputes as soon as possible, as do the majority of the British public.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, one final question to you, and rather unrelated to this, but one I think that you might find interesting. Your friend and former boss, Boris Johnson, was airbrushed out of a picture, as we discovered today, once standing next to Grant Shapps in front of a rocket, and he was spirited away by the airbrush, and then, you know, that picture was taken off the internet. Were you perplexed to see that happening, or is this what you might expect will happen to you at some stage?
It was probably some over-enthusiastic but relatively junior person who did this and has blundered, and I think we should have sympathy probably for somebody at the beginning of his or her career for making a minor mistake that has provided us all with a little entertainment.
So you're sure
Boris is not a figure you can airbrush out of anything. He is the biggest political figure in this country.
Ah, so it's not a Stalinist anti-Boris conspiracy in the upper echelons of your party to get rid of a recent prime ministerial memory?
I don't think we've quite moved to the National People's Congress where former leaders get hustled out on the basis that they've become senile yet.
OK, we'll take your word for it. Jacob Rees-Mogg, Rebecca Long-Bailey, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon denounced the government's minimum service bill, which will apply across the whole of the UK as a move to take away workers' rights, vowing to fight it all the way. She was speaking as primary school teachers in Scotland walked out after last-ditch pay talks failed to produce a breakthrough. Our Scotland correspondent Kieran Jenkins has more.
A soggy Tuesday in January. The primary schools are shut, not just here in East Renfrewshire, but everywhere in Scotland. Happy New Year! It is for 5-year-old Harry. No school today.
No.
Do you know why?
Yes.
Why?
The teachers are on strike.
And 11-year-old Laurie. What were you meant to be doing in school, do you know?
Maths.
Maths. How do you feel about missing maths?
Good.
Good. How do you feel about Laurie missing maths?
Not ideal. I'm meant to be working today. So I've got one who's going to be walking in the park with me, one going to football camp, and I'm trying to work at the same time. So, yeah, not ideal.
Parents somewhat more conflicted.
It's a difficult one. I obviously sympathise. They work really hard and they deserve to be paid well for what they do. But the children have missed a lot of their education over the last couple of years. So it's a difficult one, and just hope they get a resolution shortly.
We want 10% to pay the bills and pay the rent.
This is the second wave of teachers' strikes in Scotland this winter. All secondary schools will shut tomorrow, and there's further action planned next week, with the Scottish Government and COSLA representing local authorities in Scotland so far unable to get an agreement with teaching unions.
Unless a better, improved and credible offer appears on the table within the next few days, then we are looking at 16 days of continuous strike action across all 32 local authorities beginning next Monday. The Scottish Government and COSLA did not do nearly enough to avert today's strike action, tomorrow's strike action, but we are hopeful that they are going to do the right thing in time for next week's action to be averted.
These are certainly the strikes many parents fear, the disruption widely felt. Talks yesterday ended in no deal. Teachers demanding 10%, the Scottish Government offering half that.
You know the Scottish Government have offered nurses 7.5% pay rise.
Well, what we're looking at for the teachers is a 5% average.
5% average, so why are nurses worth 2.5% more than teachers?
Well, let me continue with some of the detail. 6.8% is what we've been offering for teachers on some of the lowest grades, with a cap on some of the proposed increases for those on the highest. And what's being proposed for teaching colleagues within cash terms is the same that was proposed for local government workers, the rest of their colleagues within local government, including those who work in schools.
And what of minimum service levels? The new law being proposed in Westminster would apply in Scotland. Is it welcomed by the Scottish Government?
Well, we're very concerned about, quite frankly, really draconian anti-trade union legislation. Trade unions play an important part in our society. They always have done, and they always will. And we're very concerned about the suggestions that are coming from the UK Government, and we'll be looking very closely at that.
The industrial action could soon spread to most schools in England and Wales. The UK's largest teaching union will reveal the results of its strike ballot next week.
I think if a union like the National Education Union, with over 450,000 members, achieves a ballot for strike action, it will be extremely significant because it can't be ignored. And it will tell the government that we are facing a catastrophe in our schools.
Teachers in Scotland say only better pay will resolve this dispute. So, more home days for Harry, more challenges for government here and perhaps across the rest of Britain soon as well.